Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Esterling. I'm a professor of public policy and political science at the University of California at Riverside. I want to thank the UCR School of Public Policy for hosting this event and the student ambassadors for helping out. I'm delighted to welcome you all today to today's webinar with our special guest, Kat Devlin, who's the research associate at Pew in Pew Research Center's Global Attitudes Project. But before bringing up Kat, I just want to take a couple of minutes to talk about the format of today's talk. So the first is we're going to have a presentation that's probably just a little bit less than an hour from Kat Devlin. And then after that, we'll open up questions and have time for questions from both the student ambassadors as well as the audience. So for audience members, if you have questions that you think of during Kat's talk, then be sure to place them into the Q&A feature. Do not send your questions via the chat, because then we won't be able to ask them, but rather use the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. If you're an audience member, you can submit your question anytime that you like during Kat's talk or during the Q&A feature. You don't have to wait until the end to submit your questions. And then what'll happen is the student ambassadors will have a chance to ask some questions, and then I'll also be able to draw from the Q&A list to pose some questions to Kat. Okay, so at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. So once again, Kat Devlin is a research associate at the Pew Research Center's Global Attitudes Project, where she specializes in international public opinion and quantitative research methods. Kat earned her master's degree from Yale, and previously she served as a Fulbright grantee in Malaysia. Kat has written on numerous topics, including public opinion in India, economic issues in Japan, global attitudes towards China, language learning in Europe, and applied data science and methods. Her research has been covered in international news outlets such as the BBC, Axios, Forbes, Agence France-Presse, I hope I got that right, and Reuters. At this moment, I will pass it on to our guest speaker, Kat, and the floor is now yours. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everybody at UC Riverside. My name is Kat Devlin. I am a research associate at the Pew Research Center's Global Attitudes team. Small fun fact about me, I grew up in a small town in New Jersey, also called Riverside. So from my Riverside to yours, thank you again for attending today, and let's get into the presentation. All right. So today I'm going to talk about the Global Legislators project, which deals with different legislators who are on Twitter. This is a newer project that my team has been doing. And so we'll get into all the aspects, both of that, a little bit about the Pew Research Center itself, and then I'm happy to answer any questions about that in the Q&A at the end as well. So the Pew Research Center is a DC-based think tank. We refer to ourselves as a fact tank because we don't take policy positions. We stay away from advocacy. We are really out there to generate a foundation of facts to inform the general public, policymakers, and audiences like you. We conduct public opinion research, demographic research, and as you'll see today, we do some content analysis, some social media analysis, and other computational social science type research. Within the center, I'm on the Global Attitudes team, but there are other teams that do also international research, but it ranges from domestic politics to science, journalism, religion. We have other teams that also dabble in international research. And we have our data labs team, which does the lion's share of the data science research. We worked in collaboration with them for this project, and I'll talk a little bit more about that collaboration in just a second. The data labs team is relatively new at Pew, and they are the in-house computational social science team. They started a project called Logos. And so the goal here was to take all of the congressional social media accounts in the US on Twitter and on Facebook and to actively collect that data and run analyses. They've been doing this since 2015, and they've studied a wide array of topics. All of that research is free and published on our website, so I encourage you to check that out if you are interested in that type of work. Here's an example from a recent report. In the 116th Congress, they weren't necessarily the most efficient in terms of getting legislation passed, but in terms of producing social media content, you can see that more than 1.5 million tweets were sent out by members, and about 680,000 posts on Facebook also went up during that period. So again, there's more about this research online. There's actually a UC Riverside alum who helped on this report, so I definitely encourage everybody to go check that out. So I gave you background in Logos because that was really the first step towards this global legislators project. My team wanted to do more data science related research. The data labs team wanted to do more international facing research, and so it made sense for us to team up here. We took the idea of Logos tracking people who were in Congress or in governments abroad and expanded it to 4 other countries. This came with some challenges that we can get into a little bit. So first, there are just more accounts because there are more people. In the US, the lists of legislators are actively maintained by various researchers, and they're available for free online. So we don't actually have to do that much work to get the lists of people in Congress in the US. But to the best of our knowledge, those lists don't exist outside of the US in the countries that we chose to study. And so we have to manually create those, check those. In some of these countries, there are snap elections. People join coalitions and then decide they're going to join another coalition. And so these are all things that our researchers have to continuously monitor and update ourselves. While we chose mostly predominantly English-speaking countries, we soon found out that in some cases, there are multiple languages that come up. One example of this is in Canada, legislators from Quebec tend to tweet in French. And so while we didn't necessarily plan for that at first, that's one thing that we have had to make some decisions on how to treat that along with all of the English language tweets that we encounter. So given all of that, our general approach was to start small, just adding 4 other countries and see what we could learn. So we ended up picking the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These, as I said, are all predominantly English-speaking places. They're allied nations of the United States. They're all members of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing group. And so for that reason, we felt comfortable with this new group of countries for this kind of experimental project when we started out. We also decided only to focus on Twitter instead of Facebook. The Twitter API is pretty open, fairly reliable. We'd used it before in personal capacities and for other projects. And so that was a tool we felt comfortable with using for several reasons. I'm happy to go into more about that part of the project, but I think for now that's just a general, good background that we can kind of get going with the actual findings here. So now I'll talk about 2 different products that came from this general project. The first is kind of our baseline study. We wanted to know, okay, now that we have all these lists assembled, who is actually using Twitter? Who are these legislators? Are there certain activities that are, kind of showing idiosyncrasies for one particular country? Are there patterns that we see across all 5 of them? These kind of questions. I'll get into the second project later on that deals more with the US elections, but for right now, we'll just focus on this general baseline project that really kicked off our global legislators endeavor. Now, we limited the amount of time that we're studying here. This database has been set up for a while, but for this project, we just looked at tweets that were produced by our legislators from January 1st through the end of June in 2019. That 6-month period gave us confidence that if you had a Twitter account, you were going to have used it during that time if you're actually, an active user of that account. And we could track some things over time and really capture the patterns that we were interested in using that time period. So the first thing that we found is that of all the legislators in our rosters, 77% had a Twitter account in some capacity. In the US, some people will have a campaign account and an official account. All of those get counted here. Among them, 73% actually tweeted at least once during the study period as well. So about 3/4 of the legislators have a Twitter account and are actively using them during this time. We were also curious if some legislators are more prolific in terms of their tweeting than others. And we found that among all of the legislators, the top 25% in terms of content generation created 65% of the tweets during this time. And the other 3/4 produced just 35%. So it's a bit imbalanced. We did a separate study on the Data Labs team that looked at US general population users of Twitter. That also showed an imbalance, but perhaps a greater one. There we found that the top 10% of general public users in the US actually created 80% of the content created by all US Twitter users. So this imbalance is not necessarily unique to the legislators, but it's not quite as imbalanced as we see in some general population studies that we've also conducted here. And I wanted to break that down by country a little bit so that you could see the variation across these 5 places. In New Zealand, the top 25% create about 3/4 of the content. In the US, it's a little bit different. The top 25% create 58% of the content. We don't know exactly why these patterns are the way they are. It's an area we could study more in the future. One hypothesis is that in New Zealand, there are just fewer legislators, especially compared to some places like the UK. And so the top 25% of tweeters is really just a couple of people. And if 1 or 2 of them behave in a certain way, that can skew the numbers a little bit. We also looked into how often people were tweeting among this legislator group. And you can see that in terms of daily tweeting, that's not actually happening very often. No more than 4% of the legislators in our rosters were tweeting on a daily basis. What's more likely is that we see them tweeting on a weekly basis. For instance, in the US, about 86% of the US legislators were tweeting at least once a week. And that ranged from 86% down to 27% in New Zealand. When we get to tracking people on a monthly basis, there about 7 in 10 or more are tweeting at least once a month. So it seems much more common for the legislators to be tweeting weekly or monthly as opposed to every single day. We also wanted to see if how often the legislators were tweeting, but also if legislators from certain countries just tended to tweet more, and the reactions that they got in terms of audience engagement. So you can see that in the US and the UK, their legislators just tend to tweet more often than in other places. In the US, there are a median of 79 tweets a month, and in the UK, that's 70. In places like New Zealand, we see a median of just 15 tweets a month. The nature of the tweets also changed a bit between countries. For instance, in the UK and Canada, about half of all of the tweets produced by legislators there are retweets of other tweets that were created elsewhere on Twitter. But just because someone is more active or you're from a country that tends to tweet more among the legislators doesn't necessarily mean that the audience is engaging with that. Across all 5 of the countries, we saw relatively few likes or favorites and retweets of these legislator tweets. We saw the most in terms of likes and favorites in the US. Each US legislator tweet received a median of 18 likes or favorites. Everybody else was at 10 or fewer. In terms of median retweets, in no country was that higher than 5. And so while some legislators may be tweeting quite a bit, they're kind of tweeting into a void in terms of audience engagement. Next, as part of this project, we looked at the hashtags that we saw within the content of the tweets themselves. And we learned a few things by doing this exercise. So first, you'll notice that in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, the top tweet in terms of the percentage of legislators who were using these terms all end in POL or POLI. And at first, we didn't know what that meant. And so we did a little bit of digging, and this is actually a tag that legislators use when they're talking about something political. These are legislators, and so you can imagine that the bulk of what they're tweeting about is political in nature. And so they just kind of sprinkle these, AUSPOL type hashtags at the end of all of their political type tweets. Hence why we see those the top used hashtags in 3 of these countries. But we don't really see that same type of behavior in the US and the UK. So there we uncovered a little bit of an idiosyncrasy in those 3 places. Next, we also saw that many of the hashtags are related to domestic issues. In the US, for example, 85% of the legislators tweeted SOTU, which is about the State of the Union address, and that happened to fall within this time frame. So that indicates to us that that was an activity that many of the legislators were paying attention to and talking about to their audiences on social media. You'll also see throughout these countries hashtags related to the budget. You'll see some other country-specific domestic hashtags like PMQs in the UK, which is kind of a fascinating process where the legislators are able to ask questions to the Prime Minister directly. It's pretty entertaining if you ever want to watch some of those. So again, most of these tend to be more domestic in nature. But in some cases, there were either events or ideas that did end up crossing the international Twitter boundaries here. The first one I would point out is that the 75th anniversary of D-Day happened during this time, and legislators in the UK, US, and Canada all used that hashtag to commemorate that historical anniversary. International Women's Day also occurred in this time period, and legislators from all 5 of the countries used either the full name of that or IWD 2019 to tag that occasion. We also saw climate change as a topic that appeared in some of the top hashtags across countries here. So while the bulk of it tends to look domestic, there are some topics that really are salient in the tweets of legislators across these places. We also looked at emojis that people were using. We found that throughout the study, 70% of legislators used at least one emoji. Though these were a bit rare, they were only in about 6% of all of the tweets that we tracked during that time period. Still, we found that legislators in the US were more likely than anyone else to use them. About 95% of the legislators sent at least one tweet. That's compared to about 61% in all of the other countries. So I guess the US legislators here are a bit more emoji happy when creating their social media content. This wasn't all just, this is a fun chart, but it wasn't all just for fun. We actually had some other research and academia-based reasons for doing this. One pattern you may have noticed is that flags are in each of the 5 countries, and usually they're in the top 1 or 2 slots here. Other research not conducted by the Pew Research Center that focused more on the US and Germany showed that when national level legislators there used flag emojis, in Germany, regardless of party, those tweets got more engagement. In the US, that same study showed that when Republicans used an American flag in a tweet, that tended to get more engagement. And if Democrats also used that, that tended to get less engagement. These activities in Germany were also more prevalent among people who were more right-leaning. And so there are some, maybe more traditional social science and political communication reasons why this is useful for us to look into. But again, there is also a fun aspect to this. For instance, in Canada, you might notice 8% of legislators used a basketball emoji. For any NBA fans out there, the Raptors won the NBA Finals during this time. So, even the legislators maybe are using a little bit of levity with some of these emojis. Next, we're going to talk about a study we conducted that is more recent. It's focused on the US election. And these tweets exist in a couple of buckets, so I'm just going to briefly cover that because I think it'll make the rest of the slides a little easier to get through. So first, when it was announced on November 7th that Joe Biden won the US election, we collected the tweets from that announcement for 1 week until November 14th. Within those tweets, anybody who specifically mentioned Biden or Trump, those tweets were flagged, and those are the bucket of tweets that we analyzed. So 1 week and had to explicitly mention Biden or Trump. Before the election, we did something similar, but for a longer period of time. So in the month of September, we collected any tweets that also mentioned Biden or Trump, and they are one bucket of analysis separate from post-election. But also in the pre-election period, we looked at any tweets that explicitly mentioned the US in several forms, America, the United States. We did some checks to make sure we were capturing everything that we thought we were capturing. But that's kind of a third bucket. So pre-election mentions of the US, pre-election mentions of the candidates, and then post-election mentions of the candidates. So this first slide deals with who was mentioning the United States specifically before the election for that 1 month period. And our thinking here was, as this election comes closer, who is actually talking about it and with what frequency is that appearing? One other thing I should mention before we get into these findings is that we excluded legislators from the US in this analysis because we were analyzing the candidates. We thought, if you're a Democrat, you're probably going to tweet a certain way. If you're a Republican, you're probably going to tweet a different way. And we're not really sure that we're bringing any, new conclusions to the table with that part of it. So we exclude them. New Zealand was also going through their own set of elections during the middle of this, and so we wouldn't be able to analyze the same group before and after the elections because inevitably some of those seats changed. So we decided to exclude them as well, just for consistency across all of these different time periods. So that's why we'll only see the UK, Canada, and Australia here. Anyway, getting back to this slide. So again, we were wondering, how salient is the US election going to be in some of these tweets as we do get closer to that day? And it turns out people were talking about it, but maybe not at the frequency that some may have thought. So for instance, in the UK, 35% of the legislators who tweeted in that 1 month period and mentioned the United States mentioned the US election in some capacity. This is more than some other topics such as historical movements or the coronavirus, but less than the amount of legislators who were talking about trade or bilateral relations in the context of the United States. So still, a third are tweeting about it, but it's not the most talked about topic in terms of mentions of the US among British legislators. In Canada and Australia, we saw even smaller proportions mentioning the US election, 9% in Canada, 14% in Australia. In Canada, it was more frequently discussed the US and issues of trade, historical events, or the coronavirus outbreak. In Australia, while 14% mentioned the presidential election, 33% mentioned an other topic, which I'll get into, and 31% mentioned the coronavirus. Mentions of this other category and the coronavirus are a bit similar. So these tweets also had to have mentioned the US. And in many of these instances, people in Australia were mentioning either Australia's response to the pandemic in comparison with the US, or they were mentioning things like the Australian education system, which we threw into that other category. And most of the time, these tweets were comparing how people in Australia thought their country was doing much better at all of those things compared with the US. So those got a little bit more of attention compared with tweets about the election, even among legislators there. Next, as I mentioned, we analyzed tweets about the specific candidates. Here, we'll compare both the candidates before and after the election. So you can see pretty clearly that the tweets that mention Donald Trump tend to be negative in tone. Negative could be anything such as wishing he loses the election. Positive would be hoping that the candidate wins the election. A neutral tweet, we consider anything that is factual or just doesn't really show an opinion, such as I will watch the debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden tonight, for instance. So again, most of the tweets that contain Donald Trump's name tended to be negative, though there were sizable portions both before and after the election that were neutral in tone. No more than 10% of the legislators who tweeted about him tweeted so in a positive manner. This is in contrast to Joe Biden. Before the election, the vast majority of legislators who tweeted about him tweeted something neutral. In contrast, negative tweets were about 1 in 5 legislators, and positive tweets were sent by about 1 in 3. But that neutral category before the election really stands out. After he won, however, the tweets became much more positive in tone. Then we go from neutral to mostly positive, 86% of the legislators tweeting positive content about Biden. Still, though, that neutral category remains sizable. 52% of the legislators mentioned something that was neutral in tone. And of course, some of these numbers can add to more than 100 because the same legislator could tweet something positive followed by something neutral. And so we would count them in multiple categories. Now, I wanted to break this down by country since, one country's legislators could, in theory, skew the overall top line numbers. But we see here that largely that's not really the case. So here we're looking at the pre-election tweets only across the 3 countries and across the 2 candidates. And you can see that in the UK, Canada, and Australia, tweets about Trump tended to be negative. The percentage of legislators who tweeted this negative content ranged from about 60 to 75%. And that's pretty consistent in terms of doing cross-country analysis like this. You also see in each of the 3 countries that neutral category goes from a little less than half to a little more than half of the legislators tweeting some sort of neutral statement about Trump. For Biden, that neutral category is also consistently the highest one across all of the 3 countries. About 8 in 10 or a little bit more of the legislators were tweeting neutral content about him. We don't exactly why the social media strategies of the legislators take on this pattern. But in the case of Biden, since we see it swing from maybe neutral before the election to positive after, people could theoretically be hedging their tweets a little bit, being a little cautious in terms of being overly positive. But again, we'll get into some of the topical coding that we did after the election in a little bit, but just wanted to lay out this general feeling in terms of sentiment before the election happened. We can't do this for every single country and every single group, but in the UK, we had enough legislators in this study that we could do a break by party. So here we look at MPs in Labour and MPs who are Conservative. You can see pretty clearly that Labour MPs, 85% who tweeted about Trump, did so negatively. And about half of them also tweeted something of neutral tone. On the Conservative side, however, about 2/3 of all tweets were neutral towards Trump. And there is a little bit of a split there, 35 versus 31% of legislators who are tweeting positive or negative content about him. Again, this is before the election. For Biden, again, the neutral category, about 8 in 10 of the legislators in the Labour Party were tweeting these neutral sentiments, and about half in Labour were tweeting something positive about Biden before the election. The Conservatives tweeted at about an equal rate neutral, negative about Biden, and many fewer legislators were tweeting anything positive about him in the run-up to the election. Now we're showing that 1 week after Biden was announced the winner by country. So you can see that the Trump tweets tended to remain negative. In the UK and Canada, about 3/4 of the legislators who tweeted about him did so in a negative way. In Australia, more were tweeting neutral, though still a sizable number of legislators tweeting negative tweets about Donald Trump. For Biden, however, we see a shift and things become more positive across each of the countries. At least 85%, though 90% in Canada, were tweeting positively about Biden. There's still a sizable neutral category in all of those, which you'll recall before the election was really the dominant category in terms of sentiment with tweets about Biden here. And we were curious, among the tweets that mention these two candidates, what exactly are people talking about? Let's give this a little bit more context. So you can see here in the post-election period, so these are tweets that specifically mention Biden. The top category across all three of the countries in terms of tweet content is congratulations or discussing the outcome of the election. That ranges from 77% in Australia to about 9 out of 10 legislators in Canada who tweeted about Biden. That wasn't the only category that we saw pretty consistently across countries, though. So for instance, bilateral relations was also the topic of several tweets about Biden. At least half of the legislators tweeting about him after the election in each of these countries mentioned that topic. We also saw numerous mentions of Kamala Harris being either the first female vice president, the first Black or Asian American vice president. Some people mentioned candidates' domestic policies. That was especially a popular category in Australia. And so, this is just a general outline of what the content of these tweets actually tell us, separate from the sentiment. Likewise, we looked at tweets about Donald Trump. This is after the election, and I'll just point out that the number of legislators tweeting about him after in this 1 week period is somewhat small in a couple of these countries. So for instance, just 19 legislators in Australia and Canada. It seems to me that the volume of tweets at this point were really more geared towards Biden and Kamala Harris winning the election, and there was just less attention paid to Trump at this point. But still a sizable number of legislators to the point where we felt comfortable analyzing these tweets were tweeting about him in some capacity. Here, again, this is 1 week after the announcement of the election. So this was prior to some of the lawsuits taking place. It was certainly before the insurrection that we saw happen, but still discussions of the election outcome were the predominant category in tweets that mentioned Trump. Talking about the candidate's character or parallels between Trump and the national leader of the country from which the legislator is from were also pretty widely talked about in some of these places, as were election updates, general talk about bilateral relations, and reflections on some of Trump's domestic policies from when he was in office. And I think with that, I will end my presentation there. I just want to say again, thank you for having me today and for joining me for this talk. All of the research that I talked about and more is available on our website. Everything is completely free to access. So I definitely encourage everybody to go there if any of these topics are of interest to you. We also go into our methods a bit more. Some other projects related to the work I talked about is available there. I am on Twitter, so you can follow me, you can follow Pew Research. All of our research teams and most of our researchers are on there. We're also on Facebook and Instagram, and you can sign up for one of our newsletters if you want email updates about when we're releasing projects and things like that. So I think now we can shift to the Q&A, and just one more time, thank you all.
Thank you so much, Kat. That was great. That was amazing. And so we have some students on the screen here that I can see on the screen. And already we have a question from Maddie Bunting.
Thank you. That was such an amazing presentation. Thank you so much for sharing that research information. I'm just wondering if you had, or your group had any hypotheses going in, if anything caught you by surprise or off guard, or if it kind of backed up maybe what you thought you would find.
Right. We do try to go into our research without too many hypotheses floating around, and really let what we're finding guide the next questions and next steps that we take. I think because we had done that research before about certain Twitter users really using the platform more frequently or producing more content, than others. We were looking to see if the legislators followed a similar pattern as I mentioned. We sometimes encounter politicians with really large social media followings. So like in the United States, AOC and Bernie Sanders have two of the most widely followed accounts. I think Mitt Romney has more than 1 million followers on Twitter at this point too. And those tend to be the ones that you hear about more. And sometimes they do tend to tweet pretty frequently. But looking at the cross-country analyses, we see that they actually, overall aren't really tweeting that much at all. And while you do have some imbalance in terms of a few people maybe creating more of the content than others, in a way, it kind of makes it feel like these legislators are just like us, normal people with their Twitter accounts who, they tweet maybe once a week or a month. They don't really get that much engagement with it, but it's part of their job and they just keep going. So it's kind of interesting to see that rather than thinking about like everybody who you hear about on the news all the time, who maybe are, politicians who have a little bit more of a celebrity essence to them. The majority of the legislators on here don't actually fall into those type of categories.
Thank you.
So far, we don't have any questions from the audience members. So audience members, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A chat. Kevin, go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for the presentation. It was really informative and just really impactful. And I think it's something that everyone can take away from. And I wanted to ask, I know you spoke a lot about how legislators are using social media, but I want to kind of focus on the reverse as well. How do you think legislators are being affected by social media? Is it possible that social media could one day directly impact the decisions legislators make and what they choose to support?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the studies that we've done so far don't necessarily measure that exactly. But I think it is telling that 77% of the legislators that we found actually have a Twitter account at all. I'm not sure that the number would be that high if left to their own devices. We see, for instance, in the UK, they have the House of Commons who are elected, but they also have the House of Lords who are lifetime appointees to the legislature or to Parliament. And we do include members from both of those houses in our analysis, but we see that the House of Lords tends to less frequently have a Twitter account. We're not 100% sure if it's because maybe people in that body tend to be older, and we know that older people don't have as much social media accounts and use. We know that from some of our other studies that we've done. I'm not just making that up or making assumptions. But also because those members are in an appointed position and they don't face elections every couple of years, perhaps that makes them feel like they have license to not necessarily need to engage with the public as much. Whereas in the US, we see that many of the legislators in Congress have not only their own official account, perhaps they had a personal account before they took office, but they have a campaign account too. So all of that is very carefully managed, and it seems to ramp up around campaigns and elections and things like that. So that might not directly answer the question, but that does seem to influence a little bit in terms of who's using it and how maybe they're thinking and strategizing about being on social media at all in the first place.
I have a question that's come in from the audience. And it's an anonymous person asks, what inspired you to get into this field? Any advice you could provide for students who wish to work in your field?
Yeah. So when I was much younger than now, I knew a little bit about statistics, but I was a political science major. I didn't, have a strong computer science background or anything like that. And it was through work that I was exposed to some of the tools and techniques and other research papers that were kind of up and coming, both in the survey research field and in the computational social science field. I then left work to go to grad school for a couple of years, and it was there that I really decided I'm going to look more into becoming familiar with data. And whether that's just being, able to read a paper and understand some of the tables that are in there, or actually designing my own experiments. I wasn't sure at the beginning, but through different classes in grad school, I was able to get more of a foundation in tools like R and tools like Stata. Now we also use SPSS at work sometimes for some of our statistics work. And so it was a little bit of curiosity, a little bit of honestly luck, and just taking classes that I thought were of interest to me, but would also be useful too, given the things that I was interested in. And now at work, like I said, I'm on the global attitudes team, and this is not a typical project that we would do. But I knew that I was interested in looking at non-survey data sources along with my survey-related work. And I just kind of bugged the data science team until they befriended me and let me work on projects with them. It also helped that my bosses were very open to the idea of doing more of this kind of research. But I think a little bit of being able to sell that this was a useful idea and something worth pursuing was also really helpful to have backing from the people in charge, kind of decide how I get to spend my time. But anyway, so the short answer is kind of follow what you're interested in, and then seek out whether it's classes in grad school, or there are tons of free online resources where you can kind of tune up some of these skills too. There are definitely tons of ways that don't cost money. They just take a little bit of time and effort to get into some of these things.
And I can also say a little bit, even though it's not my career, but as Kat mentioned, one of our alums, a student named Sono Shah, who was a PhD student in political science, who recently finished as a political science PhD at UCR, worked on this project with Kat. And so he went to graduate school and got a PhD and is doing this data science work at Pew. And so you guys, should keep that as a career track in mind, that you can go into, graduate school, whether it's getting an MPP or a PhD in policy or political science. It's just another career track. I think a lot of times people think that a PhD is kind of tracks you to a career in academia, and it certainly can. But there's because of kind of all of these exciting new fields like Kat is working in, where people are applying data science and sort of advanced methods to important practical problems in outside of, in these settings that are outside of academia, that there's different career paths that are available for you if you go through grad school. Okay, so next we have a question from Vivek. Go ahead, Vivek.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question about if you had seen any difference in the US between House members and Senate members. The House members seem to be more closer to the people. Are they tweeting more? Did you see any sort of trend there? And how did that trend carry over into other countries between the different chambers?
So we did look in the UK at House of Lords versus House of Commons. And it didn't actually look like there was that much of a difference in terms of the frequency with which they were tweeting. The difference there really was who had a Twitter account at all to begin with. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the lifetime appointed officials tended to have fewer Twitter accounts. In the US, for this study, we did not look at differences between the House and the Senate. Some of our other data labs research does look at that a little bit. From what I can remember, I don't think that there are sizable differences across those two, but that would be one thing on our website to check out more of, because they've definitely done even more in-depth studies in terms of, our members who, they use an objective measure to look at party ideology and individual ideology. And so they have studies of are the more ideologically right or left members more likely to tweet and to get more engagement without spoiling it? The answer is yes. And so those are some things that, again, those are in other studies that are on our website that I definitely encourage everybody to check out.
Okay, next we have a question from Arlette.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Arlette. My question is about, I remember you answering from a previous question saying that this was a non-survey based project. So I guess just wanting to ask, kind of be devil's advocate, if you were to create this project as surveys based, how would you do it? And if And also, what do you think the data would change? I think more of asking of what type of ideas would you want to for the future using this type of data?
So I think if I had to pair this with a survey, presumably the survey would be of this kind of elite legislative group of lawmakers. And one thing that could be interesting is to ask them, like, how often do you think you tweet? And just kind of compare that to what they actually do. I find those kind of comparisons interesting. But then I would be really curious, one, if they think that this is an effective way of reaching out to their constituents compared to other forms of outreach. So, do they actually think that the tweets are reaching people versus like a town hall in their district or lobbying on the Hill or those type of activities? That would be more US specific, I guess. But then too, I think it would be interesting to also somehow create national level surveys in some of these places and compare the Twitter activities of the general populations of places like New Zealand or the UK compared with their representatives. I would love to ask both of those groups about things like the importance of domestic issues versus foreign policy versus other areas that maybe they think are more or less important in their lives or how the government is run, and how the public views that versus how the legislators think about it and maybe even act on it in social media. That would be a very cool, though probably expensive study. But if that wasn't a limit, then that would be something I would definitely be interested in.
Great. So we have a question from the audience, and I'm going to preface this question by saying that I've actually been studying the websites of members of Congress for a while now. So in the mid 2000s, we found that about half members didn't even have a website. So a lot of this technology is new to them. And so with that background, here's the question. Again, from an anonymous attendee. How do you think that a project like this might differ in direction if it took place, say, 5 years ago? That is, how do you think the development of social media platforms and the internet itself has changed the way people might express themselves through it, as well as how you would analyze it?
Right. Well, given what you just said, I think we don't have data to show this, so I'm leery of making too many assumptions or guesses here. But I would fathom a guess that more and more people have gotten things like Twitter. I think having Facebook pages is also a fairly new phenomena for a lot of the legislators in the US, for example. And this is my personal opinion, but it seems like legislators are getting a bit more savvy with some of these tools too. And so, as kind of like the etiquette of these platforms become more nuanced, or even new portions of the public are now joining them too, I think that probably affects how these legislators may or may not use these platforms to engage with people. So again, I don't want to make too many assertions because we don't necessarily have data, but those are kind of just my own observations in this field.
That was a kind of a question that I had. Jamie Druckman at Northwestern and his colleagues have looked at campaign websites and have kind of validated that that the websites really reflect kind of the things that are happening in campaigns. But it'd be interesting to do a similar exercise with elected officials' Twitter feeds to see kind of what they're representative of. And in particular, this is kind of following up with that question that the platform itself might have an influence. And so, we worry more about misinformation and polarization in Twitter in a way that you don't really worry about that so much through websites, because websites aren't really targeted in the same way. And so it'd be interesting to see if there's some kind of influence of the platform itself on kind of the messaging that you get, right? So is that the messaging you get through Twitter, is it representative of something, right, that's of interest for us in sort of understanding how democracies work?
Yeah, I think that would be great, and it sounds interesting. One thing that we started to look at, but it didn't end up getting published here, is the information that people choose to put in their bios on Twitter. So it's a short snippet, describing who they are, whatever. And we found that in some places like New Zealand, there's a lot of boilerplate language. So representing this district, the name of the district, and then the website or the email address for that office. In the US, we saw a little bit more variation. So a lot of people saying, proud representative of this district, adding a little bit of that in there, or claiming that they are a parent or a veteran or a Second Amendment enthusiast. Those kind of things tended to pop up more in the US legislators' Twitter bios. And so if that is any indication of the content that comes along with it, it does seem like there's a little bit of a grounding in what you were saying earlier too.
Great, thank you. So next we have a question from Andrea.
Hi, I want to say thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. For my question, I first wanted to ask, I'm not sure if you've seen, there's a series called Social Dilemma on Netflix. I'm not sure if you watched it.
I have, yes.
So it kind of does touch upon like misinformation or like how social media has affected previous or impacted previous elections. I wanted to ask, like, what are your thoughts on that documentary, and do you think it is true, like how social media has played a role and impacted our elections?
Well, as a movie enthusiast, I did find the movie interesting, and I probably don't want to say too much more about it than that for fear of lots of opinions getting floated around it and things. Anywho, it is interesting because social media has obviously become a part of everybody's life in some way or another, whether you're on the platform or not. And I think that this study just goes to show that politicians are not at all immune from that, and in a way are using it more and more and more too. Especially, thinking about it, for instance, in the US, representatives go through an election every 2 years, and we see that the majority of the legislators in this database who are on Twitter are tweeting on a daily basis. And so that is using up staff time and resources to plan out that strategy, to send those tweets, to react and engage in that platform. So I think the big takeaway, at least from this study in light of your question, is that whether or not you agree with the direction that the documentary went in and the ideas that they presented, like it or not, the politicians are using these platforms and are engaging in them. And to them, it seems like worthwhile, or I would suspect they wouldn't be on the platform. And so I would probably posit the question back to you, then what does that tell us, given that there are questions raised in the documentary, but we know that they're still using it? Does that present its own problem, or should we not worry about that either? Big questions to think about that are definitely not within the realm of this study.
For sure. Okay, so now Vivek has a follow-up, another question.
So my question was about, we've been talking about misinformation and a lot of that happens through retweets. I was wondering if the Twitter API provided any data about how members retweet either tweets from other members or from sources that maybe aren't the most verified, or just in general, if they, how those retweets kind of work in the sense of legislators.
So when we pulled data from the Twitter API, we do receive the content of tweets that they have retweeted, because that does show up in their Twitter feed. There are some issues in terms of measuring the engagement based off of that, because then there are questions like, is the engagement actually coming from you retweeting it, or is the engagement due to the initial tweet going up? It's kind of confusing to talk about. And so anyway, the short answer is we don't do a ton of research into the engagement of the retweets, because the way that it comes out through the API, it's not always clear how you parse that. We don't really look in, at least in this study, into the veracity of claims in tweets or the sources of people who are sending the tweets who aren't the legislators. We have seen that legislators within parties what was that study? Over the summer, when protests related to George Floyd happened in the US and then happened in some of the other countries where we have Twitter data for the legislators, we did look at tweets related to that. And we saw that sometimes within country, and especially within country and then within party, if the leader of the party tweeted something, other members of that party were likely to retweet it. Or if that tweet did get a lot of retweets, we saw that that kind of like networked effect within the party and spreading that message was happening. That doesn't necessarily reflect what would happen in terms of like a misinformation or tweet from a dubious source or something like that, but that was just one practice or behavior that we saw in that isolated incident for a couple of weeks over the summer.
So we're coming up almost at our close. We're going to finish at 1:30. So I'm going to just say a comment to follow up on that and then pass it to Maddie, who's going to ask us the closing question. So my follow-up is thinking again about when members kind of switched over to websites, they really thought of the websites as kind of a way to just communicate their message to constituents. So they were essentially like brochures written in pixels. But there really wasn't any kind of sense that they were meant to be part of kind of a two-way representative process, right? That it kind of engaged constituents, even though the internet has this kind of interactive capability. And so it's just interesting to think about Twitter, right? That it creates this opportunity to have two-way discourse and really to think about, okay, let me cut this short because Arlette might be able to jump in with a question too. Just to think about that, is it an opportunity, right, that kind of strengthens democracy because there is sort of this opportunity to have a kind of two-way discussion with your representative, or does that not function well? But that's just an interesting thing. So I think we'll have time if Arlette, so Maddie was going to ask a closing question. So maybe Arlette, you can do your question quickly, and then Maddie will go, and then we'll have just enough time to do that.
So a quick question. I just had a question when it came to Twitter about age. I know you were mentioning how older folks don't really use Twitter, but has there been a momentum, I guess, for the younger crowd that you were seeing in the study? I mean, or maybe you weren't even able to look at that data, but yeah, that was my question.
I think if you are talking about in terms of like the engagement with the legislators and the tweets, we're not really able to easily see the ages of who these people are. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether or not they're even people, if we're being honest. So we don't have data down to that level in terms of who is interacting with the legislators and things like that.
Okay, cool. So Maddie's going to bring it home with a closing question.
Perfect. Well, I guess as a closing question, I'm just curious the future of this research. If you or the Pew Center wants to continue this maybe into, midterms or the next presidential election, and then kind of compare and contrast, say, over 10 years, these are our findings.
Yeah, the infrastructure to do that is set up. So in theory, as long as we have the endurance to keep tracking elections and people stepping down due to scandal and whatever other reasons people may join or leave the legislature, we're set up to do that. With this kind of data, I find it interesting because there really are myriad questions you could ask and try to find within the data. And you could take this in several different directions. Waiting for events is definitely one way to do it. More in-depth content analysis or network analysis would also be interesting next steps. Adding countries to the list or seeing if non-English speaking places are actually a feasible endeavor. They're all kind of, exciting opportunities for me. And so, some constraints here or there, but I think there really are several directions we could take this. So I'm hopeful about what we end up doing with it all.
Okay, well, perfect. So that's as much time as we have. So I want to thank Kat and her team again for presenting the super interesting research with us, and the students and audience members for asking really fantastically great questions. And I've enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. I hope you guys have too. And then we'll just see you all again on the next UCR SPP talk.